Phenomenology and Virtual Reality, Merleau-Ponty's Embodied Perception, and the Sense of Presence in VR Introduction. Through the headset, into the world picture, this you strap on a virtual reality headset and find yourself standing on a rickety plank stretched between two skyscrapers. Your heart pounds and your palms sweat as you inch forward logically. You know you're in your living room, perfectly safe, yet your sense of presence tells you that you are teetering hundreds of feet above a city street. Why does your body react as if the virtual world were real? To explore this question, we turn to the insights of French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his theory of embodied perception, connecting it to how modern VR systems create a being there feeling for users. Merleau-Ponty famously said, "The body is our general medium for having a world." In this video essay, we will unpack what that means and how, decades before VR existed, Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology anticipated the importance of the living body in shaping experience. Along the way, we'll draw on research from psychology and VR technology, from studies of virtual body illusion to philosophers like Gallagher, to understand how embodiment and presence intersect in virtual environments. By the end, we'll not only grasp how VR tricks the mind into feeling real, but also what VR might reveal about the nature of perception, reality, and ourselves. Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Embodiment. We are our body. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 1961, was a philosopher who argued that perception is fundamentally embodied. In other words, in contrast to the old Cartesian view of mind versus body, Merleau-Ponty insisted that mind and body form an inseparable unit. We do not have bodies like objects we carry, rather, we are our bodies in a deep sense. Our consciousness, he argued, is not a detached observer, but is always situated in a bodily context. Through the body's sensing and moving, a world opens up to us. Merleau-Ponty illustrated this with everyday examples. Consider a person wearing a hat with a feather. Without thinking, she instinctively keeps the feather from hitting door frames or lamps, as if feeling the feather's tip position, just like feeling the position of her hand, or think of driving a car. After enough practice, you don't mentally calculate the car's width to pass through a narrow gap, you just feel whether you can make it, as naturally as walking through a doorway. In Merleau-Ponty's terms, the feather or the car becomes integrated into one's body schema, the implicit sense of one's body and its capabilities. The body schema extends our sense of self to include tools or instruments. Perception, then, isn't a passive reception of data by the brain, it's an active, skillful engagement with the environment by an embodied agent. Crucially, Merleau-Ponty emphasized that our understanding of things arises from our ability to interact with them. He wrote that there must be an I can before there can be an I know. In other words, our knowledge of the world is rooted in the bodily abilities we have, our I can. For example, you know a staircase is climbable, not by abstract reasoning, but because your body can climb, and you immediately perceive the stairs as something to be climbed. Even abstract thinking is often shaped by bodily metaphor. We speak of grasping an idea or facing a problem, drawing on physical schemas. Modern cognitive science echoes this. Our brains evolved in tandem with our bodily action, and many concepts are grounded in bodily experience. We navigate a meaningful world not as disembodied minds looking at raw data, but as organisms moving, touching, seeing, and responding. The world we perceive is always for us, structured by our sensorimotor capacities, and needs. This idea of the body's centrality might sound abstract, but it has powerful implication. It means that to change one's perception of reality, you could change the body's relation to the world. This is exactly what virtual reality aims to do. By controlling the sensory inputs to a user's body, what you see, hear, and even feel, VR can alter your perceptual world. To understand how VR generates that illusion of actually being elsewhere, we need to look at the concept of presence in virtual. And we'll see that Merleau-Ponty's insights give us a framework to understand presence on a deeper level, the sense of presence. Being there in a virtual world, one of the defining goals of VR is to make the user feel a sense of presence, the subjective feeling of being there inside the virtual environment, rather than sitting in the physical one. Presence has been called the holy grail of virtual environment design, and research. In other words, you forget at least momentarily that what you're seeing and hearing is not real. Your mind and body respond to the virtual situation as if it were actually happening. When you feel genuine fear peering over a virtual cliff, even as you intellectually know it's a simulation, that's presence at work. It's important to distinguish presence from immersion. Immersion refers to the objective qualities of the system, the vividness of the display, the field of view, the tracking accuracy, the realism of the graphics and sound. A highly immersive VR system feeds your senses with detailed, consistent stimuli. For example, a wide field of view headset that covers most of your vision will typically increase immersion, but presence is the subjective result. The degree to which you feel like you're inside that virtual world. You can have a very immersive system, and yet a user might not feel present if their attention or engagement. Conversely, even a graphically simple world can evoke presence, a kind of experience rather than a property of the technology. So what makes us feel present in VR? According to researchers, a key factor is the degree of embodiment the user experiences in the virtual environment. When you use VR, you often have a virtual body or avatar within that world. How connected you feel to that virtual body is critical. VR scientists Mel Slater and colleagues describe the sense of embodiment in VR as having three main components: sense, the feeling that I, or my perceiving self, am located inside the virtual body, for example. The viewpoint is from the avatar's eyes. Sense of agency, the feeling of control over the virtual body's action. When you move your real hand and see the virtual hand move accordingly, you experience agency. You're the one causing those movements. Sense of body ownership, the feeling that the virtual body or body parts belong to you, that they are your body. This can manifest as the eerie but powerful illusion that a virtual hand is your own hand, especially if the visuals and touch sensations. In a well-designed VR experience, these factors combine to create a strong embodied presence. For instance, the system tracks your head and hand movements and updates the virtual scene instantly, preserving the natural sensorimotor contingencies. When you turn your head, the view shifts just as it would in real life, etc. This tight linkage between your motor actions and the resulting sensory feedback is crucial. In fact, the connection between motor inputs and perceptual outputs. Unlike watching a movie, in VR you can look around in any direction, and the world stays consistent. You are an active observer. This brings our primitive perceptual capacities into play. The same reflexes and understanding we use to navigate the real world start operating in the virtual one. To illustrate, imagine you're in a VR simulation of a kitchen. You see a virtual arm extending in front of you. You decide to reach out and open a cabinet. You extend your physical arm, holding a control. You hear the door creak and see it open. If all goes well, your brain integrates the visual information with your motor intention and proprioceptive sense. The VR designers will use tricks like rendering a pair of virtual hands where your real ones would be, using first-person perspective and providing haptic vibrations or resistance for feedback, all to convince your subconscious body-mind system that this is me in here. Presence arises when the technology fades away from your awareness. One telepresence researcher put it like this: only when the VR interface, the goggles, gloves, etc., is absorbed by the body schema, treated by your brain as just another part of you, will a true sense of presence be induced. You cease thinking about the hardware and feel, I am there in that virtual space. Presence, then, is a holistic illusion. It involves perception, sensing the virtual environment as real, action behaving in that environment with a feeling of efficacy, and cognition, temporarily believing in the scenario. Some VR theorists break it down into subcategories: physical presence, emotional presence, to capture the idea that you can feel present not just in a place, but in a situation or interaction, but across all these types. The common thread is embodied response. Your brain and body respond to the virtual environment appropriately, as if it were real. This might mean your palms sweat on that virtual plane, or you instinctively duck if a virtual object is thrown at you. Now, let's connect this back to Merleau-Ponty. How does his embodied phenomenology help explain why VR presence is even possible? I can in cyberspace. Merleau-Ponty's insights, captured in his notion of the primacy of the I, can turn out to be a perfect lens to understand presence in VR. In our normal life, we perceive the world in terms of what we can do in it. A doorway solicits walking through. A coffee cup invites grasping. These action possibilities were later termed affordances. Gibson affordances are opportunities for action that objects or environments provide relative to our body's capabilities. Merleau-Ponty's embodied perception was essentially an affordance-based view. Before the term existed, my body is wherever there is something to be done. Our body actively seeks out and responds to the affordances in the world. Now consider a well-crafted VR. It presents you with a simulated world where you can do things, pick up a virtual bow and shoot an arrow. When those actions feel natural and effective, the virtual environment offers meaningful affordances, and you instinctively perceive them as real, for your presence thrives on this. In fact, one philosophical study explicitly argues that the crucial determinants of presence are perception of affordances and sense of embodiment. You tend to feel like you are truly there. Let's break that down. Suppose a VR simulation portrays a simple object, like a ball on a table. If the system allows, you might reach out and pick up the ball the moment you do so. Seeing your virtual hand grasp it, and maybe feeling a controller vibrate to mimic touch the ball, ceases to be merely pixels. It has weight simulated, texture, maybe via controller haptics, and responds to your actions. You can throw it, and it flies. You have discovered an afford. This virtual ball is throwable, just as a real ball is. If, instead, the ball just a static 3D image you couldn't interact with, it would feel less real, more like a movie prop. VR designers know this. Intuitively interactive environments with rich affordances tend to engender higher presence than passive panoramic scenes. The more you can do, the more you feel I am here, in this world, doing things. As Merleau-Ponty might say, you inhabit the virtual world through your capable body. Presence clicks when the user internalizes the virtual environment. Our sense of reality depends on the constant loop of action and perception. You move, and the world's appearance changes accordingly. Philosopher Gallagher, who builds on phenomenology in cognitive science, notes that when our body is in tune with the environment, we operate smoothly and often without conscious attention. The body and world are harmonized. VR aims to create that same harmony artificially. If you turn your head, and there's even a tiny delay before the view shifts, or if your virtual hand movement doesn't quite line up with your real hand motion, your brain's prediction is violated, and you'll be jarred out of the illusion. It might even make you motion sick. But when the VR responds with sufficient fidelity, low latency, accurate tracking, your perceptual system says, okay, this feels consistent with my own movement, and it can settle into that transparent, unself-conscious mode of operation. In phenomenological terms, the intentional arc you perceive through the virtual body into the virtual world, rather than perceiving the virtual body as an external object. The VR interface itself, the hardware, the code disappears from your experiential field. It becomes an absently available means of action. As Gallagher puts it, this is exactly what a well-adjusted body schema does with a tool. Incorporate it and forget it's there in VR. Your body schema can incorporate a virtual body. Merleau-Ponty's maxim, I can therefore, I am, to riff on Descartes. Empirical research backs this up in experiments. Adding interactivity and responsive feedback increases participants' reported presence. For example, giving users the ability to walk around, even if using teleportation or walking in place, compared to scenarios where they are just passive observers. One study concluded that presence in VR is essentially related to our sense of embodiment and possibility of action. In other words, just as Merleau-Ponty might have predicted, a VR that enables rich, embodied I cans will produce a stronger I am there virtual body. Illusions and insights from VR embodiment to really appreciate how VR leverages our embodied perception. Let's look at some striking VR experiments and illusions that scientists have developed, many of which read like science fiction, but are real. These not only demonstrate the principles we've been discussing, they also reveal the profound implications of VR. This builds on the famous rubber hand illusion from psychology, where a person can be fooled into feeling that a fake rubber hand is their own hand by synchronizing strokes on the fake hand with strokes on the hidden real hand. VR takes this to another level. For instance, in a study by Mel Slater's group in Barcelona, participants donned a VR headset and saw a virtual body from the first-person perspective, as if looking down at themselves. When the participant looked at a mirror in the virtual environment, they saw an avatar, a character, mimicking all their movements in real time in one condition. A female avatar was used, so a male participant would see a young woman in the mirror copying his head and arm motion. After a few minutes of guided movements, touching virtual floating balls near the hands and feet to reinforce the association, the transition was often subconscious and quick, as one observer described. The embodiment phase was complete. I had tricked my brain into thinking that the virtual limbs were mine, despite the avatar looking obviously different from the person's real body. The combination of aligned visual motor feedback and first-person perspective created a genuine sense of body ownership. Now, why is this significant? Because once someone accepts the virtual body as theirs, this is a core aspect of present in the Barcelona Labs demo. After embodiment, they introduced a social scenario. The participant embodied as the young woman experiences a virtual man walking into the room and eventually approaching aggressively, yelling insults initially. I know this isn't real, but as the man comes very close, violating the personal space of the avatar, increased heart rate, anxiety, even fear. One journalist who underwent this scenario wrote, "I felt physically threatened, as though my actual body were in danger. This isn't real," I told myself still. I felt afraid. Her bodily reactions, flinching, leaning back, heart pounding, occurred even as her conscious mind knew it was an avatar. The experiment even had a deeper purpose. This simulation has been used in rehabilitation programs for domestic violence offenders. In controlled studies, men who went through the VR embodiment of a female victim were later better at recognizing fear in women's faces. Some even reported that they instinctively tried to protect themselves in VR, saying, "I thought he was going to hit me, so I covered my face," forgetting for a moment that the threat wasn't real. This is a powerful demonstration of how deep presence and embodiment can translate into psychological change. In this case, a learning experience that might generalize back to real life. It underscores a point Metzinger. Embodied virtual experiences can change us profoundly. Another line of research has explored how changing the virtual body can change our perceptions. In one study, adults were embodied in a child's body in VR. When they looked down, they saw a small body with short arms and legs. Intriguingly, these participants began to perceive the virtual world scale differently. Objects felt larger, as if seen through a child's eyes. Their estimation of sizes adjusted accordingly. In another famous study, white participants were embodied in a black avatar for a short time. Before and after, they took implicit bias tests. The result: after the VR session, their implicit racial bias scores were significantly lower and remained reduced when tested again a week later. The researchers hypothesized that actually living in the skin of another, even virtually, can temporarily disrupt deep-seated biases and foster empathy. Similarly, others have used VR to let men experience a simulation, as if they had a female body, or even to let participants. In each case, the sensorimotor trick is the same. By aligning what you see and do with a different body, the brain's sense of embodiment can be transferred to that body. It's as if VR provides a temporary transplant of the first-person perspective into a new form. Philosophers like Thomas Metzinger find these results fascinating. What Metzinger calls the self-model can be manipulated. We normally feel our self and body are one, but VR shows the brain can swiftly incorporate a fake body into the self-model. If the conditions are right, as Metzinger notes, we effectively live inside a model of our own body generated by the brain, and VR is giving us the tools to hack that model. Even beyond human body, VR has induced other strange illusions. In research inspired by out-of-body experiences, OBS, participants have worn VR headsets that show a view of their own body from a few feet behind using a camera, and then felt touches or vibrations that are offset from their real body. Some reported the uncanny sensation of floating outside their body or seeing themselves from a detached perspective. Metzinger himself participated in such an experiment with neuroscientist Olaf Blank, he saw his own back from behind. These setups underscore how flexible body awareness is normally. Don't worry, you can't lose your soul in VR. As soon as the headset is off, your brain reverts to normal. The fact that VR can induce OBA-like sensation and ownership of non-self objects, like feeling that a virtual avatar's hand or a tool is your own, is a testament to the brain's embodied plasticity. Philosophers such as Gallagher have studied cases of neurological patients, like those with lost proprioception, to show how much we typically take our effortless body awareness for granted. VR gives us a way to play with that system, usually safely, to learn how it works. It's worth noting that for these illusions to work, the VR technology often has to vanish from the user's attention. The head-mounted display and controllers must become transparent mediums. When you are fully focused on the virtual world and responding to it, you stop noticing the weight of the headset on your face. Better tracking, even gloves that let you use your fingers, naturally tends to improve presence. It reduces the friction that reminds you this is just a device, as one researcher put it. The ideal is to have the VR gear so well integrated that the user's body schema absorbs it. At that point, the user can interact with the virtual environment in a seamless and pre-reflective manner. The technology recedes. What all these experiments show is the flip side of Merleau-Ponty's insight. Just as our natural perception can incorporate a tool or adapt to a new sensorimotor situation, VR can provide novel sensorimotor situations that our perception will readily adapt to. Our sense of presence and self is robust, yet adaptable. We remain embodied agents. VR is, in effect, a grand phenomenological experiment, a way of tweaking the conditions of perception and seeing what happens. This yields incredible opportunities for therapy, training, art, empathy building, but also some challenges and limits. Challenges to embodiment and presence in VR for all its magic. Current virtual reality is still far from a perfect simulation of the real world. Merleau-Ponty's perspective actually helps us articulate where VR falls short, because it reminds us it's here that philosophers like Ihde and others have critiqued VR for its limitations. Movement and the full body in real life. Your body is constantly in motion. You walk around, you feel gravity and balance. You can touch and manipulate things with fine-grained feedback. VR, however, often puts you in a constrained physical situation. Typically, you might be standing in place or seated while your virtual body walks or flies. You're often tethered to a small area. You can't truly run across a virtual field unless you have a special treadmill or physically climb a virtual ladder with your whole body. This creates an odd discrepancy. Your visual and vestibular senses might say you're moving, but your body isn't actually moving through space. That can be a giveaway, and it's a cause of VR motion sickness for some people. No matter how engrossing the imagery, part of you remains like an audience member, seated and looking, rather than a fully free-moving agent. He even notes that the traditional cinema had a similar, though less intense. Viewers sit mostly still, watching motion on screen, yet early filmgoers still ducked and screamed at an oncoming train shot because their embodied perception was triggered in VR. But so are the reminders of artifice whenever you hit the boundaries of your physical space. Closely related is the reductive sensorium of current VR. Real life is multisensory. Beyond sight and sound, we have touch, temperature, proprioception, body position sense, the feeling of weight, even smell and taste. Most VR setups primarily engage vision and hearing. Some advanced systems include haptic controllers that vibrate or gloves that give force feedback, and a few research labs experiment with smell or wind machines. But by and large, it's an ocular-centric experience with some token haptics. Ihde has critiqued VR as a kind of extreme extension of visualism, calling fully immersive visual simulations primitive, crass, and regressive if they neglect the other dimensions of bodily experience. That may sound harsh, but his point is that a simulation which only or mainly engages one sense will always be reductive in comparison with whole body experience. You won't feel the breeze or the sun's warmth through a headset unless technology gets much more advanced. Even something as simple as the resistance when you push against an object, or the texture under your fingertips, is largely missing at best, simulated by vibration. Consequently, VR has a hard time simulating certain affordances. You can see a virtual apple and pick it up, but you won't feel its weight or smoothness. You can swing a virtual sword, but there's no satisfying clang or resistance when it hits a shield. From a Merleau-Ponty view, perception is integrative. All senses contribute to our sense of reality. VR's focus on vision means it sometimes struggles to convince the body's other channels that said, our vision is very dominant in human. So if you get the visuals and spatial audio right, people often fill in the rest with imagination. But there's a reason researchers are actively developing better haptics and even experiments. Another challenge is what we might call the fragility of presence. Presence can be strong in one moment and vanish the next. VR users are familiar with the experience of being deeply immersed, or you accidentally stick your virtual head through a wall due to a tracking error, or a real-world interruption occurs, like someone tapping your shoulder, and poof, the spell is broken. You're instantly aware of the room you're actually in and the fact that you're wearing a device. Presence requires a continuous convincing of the perceptual system. Breaks in consistency term breaks in presence in the literature. This is reminiscent of a point by phenomenologist Sean Gallagher. Normally, our body remains absent from our attention. We don't think of our legs while walking, we just walk. But if something goes wrong, say you stub your toe, suddenly the body springs into awareness. Similarly, in VR, when everything is running smoothly, you don't think about the hardware or the artifice. But any hiccup can make you reflect, oh right, I'm in VR, breaking the immersive flow. This is why developers strive to eliminate lag, increase frame rates. Beyond technical and sensory limits, there is a deeper philosophical challenge. Is being in a VR world truly the same as being in the real world? Merleau-Ponty would likely say not exactly, because the meaning context is different. In a way, VR offers a paradoxical state. You are and are not in the world. As one commentator noted, classic phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty never envisioned a world that could exist both within the world of everyday reality and apart from it. A world within our world. The VR exists in a computer, in a room that we experience. At some level, you might always know this isn't truly happening yet. On another level, you feel it is. The very term virtual reality highlights this tension. It is a virtual, not physically actual experience. Psychologically, the consequences can be real fear, joy, learned skills, changed attitudes. Thomas Metzinger and Michael Madury have raised concerns about potential long-term effects on our perception of reality. They suspect that heavy use of VR might trigger symptoms where individuals feel detached from their body or feel the external world is unreal. Essentially, if one spends too long in virtual worlds, one might start to experience a kind of bleed over where the real world feels strangely fake or dreamlike because one's brain has gotten used to the VR context. This is not a common occurrence for most users, but it's been reported anecdotally. For example, a VR user who spends 8 hours in VR and then takes off the headset might need a few minutes to ground themselves. Is the real world? Metzinger's worry is that we may damage the neural mechanisms that create the feeling of reality if we overuse extremely immersive VR. At the very least, this is an area calling for careful study. It shows that VR's power cuts both ways. The same technology that can give us enlightening experiences can also confuse our embodied orientation. Beneficial in moderation, potentially disorienting in excess. Gallagher might add that our embodied being has an inherent orientation toward finding a stable reality. And if VR constantly shifts that reality, it could lead to adaptive challenges for our brain. Don Ihde, from a different angle, challenges VR by reminding us of what he calls the multi-stability of technology experiences. In his view, technologies can mediate our experience, but we always retain the capacity to step back and recognize the mediation. No matter how deep the VR, we can take off the headset. This ability to oscillate between immersion and awareness. Ihde would likely say that VR will never be a complete replacement for reality, because part of being human is exactly this flexibility to go in and out of different experiential frames. He famously noted that however enchanted we are by simulated worlds is the existential indicator that we remain embodied beings in a life world. Reality, Remixed, what VR teaches us about perception, and being virtual reality, when viewed through the lens of phenomenology. It's a kind of philosophical probe by simulating worlds and bodies. VR shines light on how our perception and sense of reality work. So, what have we learned by bringing Merleau-Ponty's embodied perception theory into the VR realm first? VR only succeeds if it engages the user's body and action possibilities. If human perception were just a passive camera in the head, we might be content to sit back and watch 360 degrees videos. But true presence comes when we do things, and the virtual world responds. This validates Merleau-Ponty's claim that we know our world by moving through it and interacting with it. In VR, when your movements and intentions are honored by the simulation, your perception says this is real. As one VR researcher put it, our embodied mind treats consistent sensorimotor patterns as reality, period, in practice. Not because we're gullible, but because reality for us is what is experientially available to our embodied consciousness. Second, VR dramatically demonstrates the plasticity of the self and body. Metzinger's idea that we live in a self-model crafted by the brain gains experimental support change. The model via a virtual avatar or an out-of-body viewpoint, and you change the experience itself. That our sense of owning a body can drift into a virtual proxy shows the brain's embodiment mechanisms are more concerned with continuity and correlation of sensations. The fact that people can have strong emotional and even lasting cognitive changes, like reduced bias from a brief virtual embodiment experience, suggests that our identity and perspective are at least somewhat moldable. Philosopher Don Ihde noted that technologies can amplify or reduce aspects of our experience. VR, in this sense, it's like a practice field for empathy and imagination, letting you literally step into someone else's viewpoint. It also reveals that many things we take to be fixed, like personal space boundaries or fear responses, are actually responses of our embodied organism to a perceived situation. And if you recreate that situation virtually, you get the same response. Reality, it turns out, is partly in the relation, not just the raw physicality. VR capitalizes on that relational nature of reality. Third, Phenomenology helps temper the more extreme claims about VR. In the 1990s, some enthusiasts speculated that virtual worlds might become so real that we'd live in them, shedding our bodies and achieving a kind of digital transcendence. But Merleau-Ponty and later thinkers like Ihde and Gallagher remind us that you cannot escape embodiment. Even in VR, you drag your body with you, so to speak. Both literally, you still have a body sitting in a chair, and in terms of how the experience is built, it's all about fooling the senses and muscles you have, rather than VR being a pathway to disembodiment. You get a new body virtual, but you use it by leveraging your real body's capacities in a cheeky sense. You can't just be a mind floating in a void of data. You need a perspective, a simulated body and world. The Cartesian dream of uploading consciousness to a computer runs into the wall, but consciousness isn't a software program. It's an activity of an embodied being. VR, at its best, gives us a new embodiment, not a disembodiment, and at its worst, if it is designed poorly or used recklessly, it doesn't free us from the body. It upsets the body, leading to nausea or confusion, which is an embodied reaction to forth. VR invites us to reflect on the nature of reality itself. When people remove a headset after a deeply immersive simulation, they often say things like, "Wow, that felt so real." It naturally begs the question, what makes something real to us? Is it the physical existence of objects? Clearly not, because virtual objects can feel real enough to trigger reflexes. Not entirely. You can know something is fake, but still feel it, as real horror movies teach us that. Phenomenology would answer, something feels real when it is experienced as a coherent part of our life world, when it has presence, when we can interact with it, when it fits into our pragmatic context of being. VR shows that reality is partly a construction of the brain, a virtual reality of sorts. Metzinger, indeed, calls the normal waking experience a form of virtual reality in our head generated by the brain's model. VR just swaps out the external source with an artificial one, but our brain's model-making machinery runs the same as ever when the input is plausible enough. The brain's model of self and world updates to accommodate the virtual environment. This doesn't mean there's no difference between real and virtual, but it does mean that our criterion for reality, experientially, is immersion and engagement. As philosopher Don Ihde might say, VR is real as human experience, even if it's not real as physical objecthood. It reveals presence, to borrow a Heideggerian concept mentioned by some VR artists. In that moment of immersion, the presence of the virtual world is truly present to you. There is also a humbling lesson. Our sense of reality is more fragile than we might assume. It can be tricked, or, less judgmentally, it can transpose to a new setting with relative ease. This teaches us not to take our everyday perception for granted. We normally assume seeing is believing. But VR reminds us that believing is seeing too. What you accept, you perceive. It's a call back to the phenomenological urge to always consider the role of the subject, the perceiver, in constituting the experience. The world as we experience it is always partly our world, filtered and shaped by our embodiment. Finally, VR's interplay with phenomenology. Metzinger and Madere, as we saw, propose a code of ethics for VR, because they realize how powerful this medium is at tapping into our fundamental sense of self and reality. If embodied virtual experience can affect us in ways we barely understand, redefining the relationship we have to our own mind, then clearly we need to step carefully. But that potential for redefinition is also what makes VR so fascinating for philosophers and psychologists. By observing how people adapt to VR, we can better understand phenomena like perception, self-consciousness, agency, and embodiment in the baseline reality VR is. To wrap up, consider Merleau-Ponty's line, "To be a body is to be tied to a certain world." Our body is not primarily in space. It is a void. In our ordinary life, our body is tied to the physical world around us, a virtual one for a short time. Our body or body image is of that virtual space. We have, amazingly, the ability to bind ourselves to a second world, but we never leave the first one. Entirely, our physical body is still here, even if our mind roams. Thus, VR adds a layer to Merleau-Ponty's insight. We are our body, and our body can imaginatively inhabit worlds beyond the actual. Yet, every such inhabiting is temporary and dependent on our continuing embodied existence. Perhaps with new eyes, VR, at its best, can renew our wonder at how simply being present works. As the artist Char Davies, who created famous early VR art pieces, observed, VR can let us encounter the world in a primitive way, suspending our habitual perception, leaving us with an authentic feeling of the living body in the virtual space. One that Merleau-Ponty would surely have found intriguing. In conclusion, the convergence of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology and virtual reality research. The body is the foundation of presence. VR succeeds insofar as it speaks the language of our body, their motions, senses, and innate orientation toward a world. It also shows the profound truth, whether that world is physical or virtual, we hunger for a sense of belonging to it through perception and action. Merleau-Ponty's embodied perception predicted that if you could create the right correspondence between self and world, you'd get an experience of reality. And VR has confirmed that in spectacular fashion. Yet his philosophy also challenges VR to remember what it cannot fully replicate. The unfakeable presence of a living sentient body embedded in a meaningful world, VR, virtual or real ours. And that is a pretty amazing thing, to realize that the sense of presence is, after all, an expression of our own embodied mind, which remains the ultimate reality maker. So next time you put on a VR headset, take a moment to appreciate the wonder that a mesh of light, sound, and code can convince the Merleau-Pontian body that it's in another world. And by the same token, reflect on how your perception of the so-called real world is also an active, embodied achievement. VR doesn't replace reality, but it certainly enriches our understanding of it by showing us the gears of perception at work. In the end, phenomenology and VR together remind us that to be present anywhere is to embody a point of view in a world. And now we can create new worlds to embody, expanding the horizons of what we can perceive, do, and ultimately understand about ourselves.